The first shot rang out 2 miles from Maude Fletcher's property line, and by the time the second one echoed across the Red Canyon walls of Dry Creek, Arizona, in the spring of 1882, she had already loaded her own rifle and was standing in the doorway of her homestead with her jaw set like iron. Maude Fletcher was not a woman who frightened easily. At 28 years old, she had buried a husband, fought a bank in territorial court over 30 acres of scrubland that everyone told her wasn't worth fighting for, and raised 2 boys on hardtack and stubbornness through 2 brutal winters. She had calluses on her hands from the well rope, and a scar on her left forearm from the day a rattlesnake had disagreed with her method of removing it from the chicken coop. She was lean and sun-browned, and wore her dark hair in a braid so tight it could have held a fence together, and the people of Dry Creek, Arizona, all agreed on at least one thing about Maude Fletcher, which was that she was the last woman in the territory who needed anyone's help. So when the horse came limping up the long dirt track toward her house with a rider slumped low over the saddle, Maude did not lower her rifle. She watched the horse stop at the gate post and stand there with its head hanging low, foam drying at its mouth, one foreleg trembling just slightly. The rider did not fall. He held on with a grip that seemed less like intention and more like the body's last desperate refusal to let go. His hat had been lost somewhere along the way. His shirt, which had once been a deep blue, was soaked dark on the left side in a way that Maude recognized immediately and did not like one bit. "Get off the horse," she called, slowly, "and keep your hands where I can see them." The rider lifted his head. He was younger than she expected, maybe 30, maybe a year or 2 on either side. He had a square jaw dusted with several days of dark stubble and brown eyes that were glassy with pain but still managed something that was almost sheepish, as if he were embarrassed to be in this condition on a stranger's property. His left hand gripped the saddle horn. His right hand, she noticed, stayed visible, fingers spread, in a deliberate and careful gesture of surrender. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was rough but steady, "I'm not here to cause you any trouble." "You're already causing me trouble," Maude said. "Who fired those shots?" "The Garner boys," he said. "3 of them. They rode off when I cut through the canyon. I think they figured the bleeding would do the rest." Maude studied him for another long moment. The horse swayed. The rider's jaw tightened against what she suspected was considerable pain, and he did not make a sound. "What's your name?" she asked. "David Lawson." The name hit her like a thrown stone, and she almost took a step backward. David Lawson. She knew that name. Every person within 100 miles of Dry Creek knew that name, though most of them knew it the way you knew the name of an oncoming storm, with wariness and no small amount of dread. David Lawson had ridden with the Garner outfit 2 years ago, back when the Garner brothers were terrorizing the whole of the Sulphur River Valley, burning out homesteaders, stealing cattle, and generally making themselves the kind of men that respectable people did not invite to supper. He had been their best gun hand, according to the stories, their scout, their enforcer, the man who rode ahead and figured out where the law wasn't looking. And then, about a year ago, the stories had changed. Nobody was quite sure what had happened, only that David Lawson had ridden away from the Garner outfit under circumstances that nobody could pin down with certainty, and that the Garner brothers had put a price on his head shortly after. Some said he had stolen money from them. Some said he had refused an order, and things had gone badly from there. Some said he had turned informant for the territorial marshal's office, and the Garners had found out before anything useful could come of it. Maude had heard all 3 versions, and had no particular faith in any of them. What she did know, standing there in her doorway with the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard, was that the man was bleeding and the horse was spent, and the Garner boys were somewhere out in that canyon, and had apparently decided the job was finished. She was the last person who expected to let him in. "Get down off that horse," she said, lowering the rifle a fraction of an inch, "before you fall off it and crack your skull on my fence post, and then I'll have 2 problems instead of 1. David Lawson dismounted with the careful deliberateness of a man who knows every movement is going to cost him something. He got one foot on the ground and then the other, and then he stood there gripping the saddle, breathing through his nose, getting himself arranged. He did not ask for help. He let go of the saddle and walked to her gate under his own power, and Maude noted with reluctant respect that he did not stagger more than once. She stepped aside to let him through the door. "Sit down at the table," she said, "and if you get blood on my good chair, I will be very put out with you." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and despite everything, the corner of his mouth moved. Her boys, Eli and Thomas, were 8 and 10 respectively, and had been watching from the doorway of the back room with their eyes enormous and their mouths shut tight, which told Maude they had heard enough of the conversation outside to understand that this was not a moment for questions. She pointed at Eli, who was the younger one and the faster runner. "Go out to the barn and put that horse in the far stall. Give it water, but not too much at once. Then come right back inside and stay there." Eli went without a word, which was unlike him, and told her everything about how the situation had read to her children. Thomas she sent to fetch the tin box from under her bed, the one that held her medical supplies, which were not extensive but were not nothing either. She had learned what she needed to know about wound care in the hardest of ways, in the months after her husband Calvin had been thrown from a horse and lingered for 3 weeks with a broken back before the fever took him, and she had spent those weeks doing what she could with what she had. She was not a doctor, but she knew how to clean a wound and how to pack it, and how to tell the difference between bleeding that was going to stop on its own and bleeding that was not. David Lawson's wound was in the upper left side of his back, a clean through and through from a rifle at moderate distance, which was fortunate in the sense that the bullet had not stayed inside him, and unfortunate in the sense that the exit wound was larger than the entry, and had done considerable damage to the surrounding muscle. He sat quietly while she worked, his arms braced on the table, his face turned away, and he made no sound except for one sharp intake of breath when she poured the carbolic acid into the entry wound, and then another when she did the exit. "I'm sorry," she said, which surprised her because she was not generally a woman who apologized for doing necessary things. "Don't be," he said. "I've had worse done with less care." She believed him. "The Garner boys," she said, working as she talked because it was easier to ask difficult questions when her hands were occupied. "Are they likely to come back this way?" He was quiet for a moment. "Not tonight. They'll assume I'm finished. But Walt Garner is not the kind of man who likes uncertainty, and when he doesn't find a body, he'll send someone to look." "How long?" "Day, maybe 2. Maude tied off the bandage with a neat knot and sat back. "Then you'll need to be gone before then." "Yes, ma'am," he said again. He turned slowly and looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was harder to read than pain. It was something older and quieter, a careful kind of acknowledgement, as if he understood exactly what she had done by letting him in and what it was costing her and was not going to pretend otherwise. "I'm sorry to bring this to your door." "You didn't choose to get shot," she said. "I chose plenty of things before that," he said. "That made getting shot a reasonable outcome." She looked at him for a moment. "Well," she said finally, "you can sleep in the barn. I'll bring you supper out there. You'll stay out of sight and away from my boys, and in the morning we'll see how you're standing." He nodded. "That's more than fair." "It's not about fair," she said, and she wasn't entirely sure what she meant by that, only that it was true. She brought him out a plate of salt pork and cornbread and a tin cup of strong coffee at dusk, and he was sitting up in the far stall with his back against the wall, and the horse she'd learned was named Copper standing close by with a kind of animal loyalty that she found herself unable to ignore. She set the plate down on the hay bale beside him and stood back. "You want to tell me what actually happened with the Garners?" she asked. He picked up the cornbread and ate a piece before he answered. She appreciated that. A man who could eat when he was wounded was a man who was going to live. "I rode with them for about 8 months, he said. "I was 27 and I needed money, and I told myself that the work was the work and it didn't matter where it came from." "What changed?" He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the first stars were appearing above the canyon walls, and the desert night was settling in with its particular cold clarity. "We rode to a place called Harker's Crossing," he said. "Little settlement, maybe 12 families, mostly folks from back east who'd come out with nothing and built something out of nothing. Walt wanted their water rights. They didn't want to sell." He paused. "He didn't ask twice." Maude said nothing. "I didn't fire," he said. "I want you to know that. I sat on my horse at the edge of that settlement and I didn't fire. But I also didn't stop it, and that's a thing I have to live with every day of my life." "What did you do?" "I rode away," he said. "And then I rode to the territorial marshal's office in Tucson, and I told them everything I knew about the Garner outfit, which was considerable. And then I rode out before they could decide whether to arrest me or deputize me, and I've been moving ever since." Maude looked at him. The lamplight was thin out here and she couldn't read all of his expression, but she could read enough. There was no performance in what he'd said, no attempt to make himself heroic. He told it plain, the part that he was ashamed of included, and that told her more about him than any number of defended actions would have. "Harker's Crossing," she said. "I heard about that. The marshal out of Tucson came through here asking questions about the Garners about 6 months ago. That would have been Henderson," he said. "He's a decent man. He's the one who got the warrants. The Garner brothers are still riding free. Walt Garner has friends with money," David said simply. "Friends with money have friends with lawyers, and lawyers in the territorial courts are a different kind of weapon than anything I know how to handle." Maude thought about her own years in territorial court, fighting for 30 acres of land against a banker named Prescott who had friends with money and friends with lawyers, and she felt something shift in her chest that she didn't entirely want to name. "Get some sleep," she said. "I'll check your bandage in the morning." She went back to the house and sat at her kitchen table in the dark for a while, listening to her boys breathe in the back room and thinking about things she had decided long ago not to think about anymore. In the morning, she half expected him to be gone. He was not gone. He was standing at the side of the barn in the early light, carefully working his left arm in slow circles with the expression of a man who is cataloging exactly how much damage has been done and making plans accordingly. He'd found the pump and washed up, and his dark hair was damp at the temples. Without the coating of trail dust, he looked younger and more complete, if still pale under the brown. Eli and Thomas had already found him by the time Maude came out with coffee, because her boys had not inherited her capacity for staying away from things that interested them, and they were standing in front of him with the blatant, unashamed curiosity of boys who had grown up in a place where strangers were rare and therefore fascinating. "Are you a gunfighter?" Thomas asked. "Thomas," Maude said. "I'm not," David said, his eyes flicking to Maude with something that might have been amusement. "I'm a man who made some bad choices and is trying to make better ones." Thomas considered this. "That's what Mama says about the Hensley brothers when they come through drunk." "Thomas," Maude said again with more force. She handed David the coffee and looked at his arm. "How bad is it?" "Stiff," he said, "but workable. I can ride." "Not today you can't," she said, and the bluntness of it surprised even her. She had meant to say something practical about the horse, about Copper needing another day's rest, which was also true, but what had come out was something more direct than that. He looked at her over the rim of the tin cup. "You sure about that?" "The Garner boys won't come looking in daylight," she said. "They'll send someone at night if they send someone at all, and I've got a clear line of sight on all 3 approaches to this property. You'd be safer here today than on the trail." It was true. It was also not the complete truth, but she was not yet ready to examine the part that wasn't complete. He stayed. The day was strange and quiet in the way that days can be when something is happening underneath the surface of it that nobody is acknowledging out loud. David Lawson was not an idle man. He found the fence post on the east side of her property that had been leaning at a worrying angle since February, and without being asked he dug out the base and reset it, working with his right arm primary and his left arm providing what support it could. He found the hinge on the chicken coop door that had been giving her trouble and fixed it with a piece of wire and a steady hand. He did not talk much while he worked, but when Eli came out and stood beside him asking questions with the relentless specificity of an 8-year-old, he answered them with patience and without condescension, explaining the mechanics of the fence post in terms that were simple without being simple-minded. Maude watched from the kitchen window and told herself she was watching the perimeter. At noon she brought lunch out to the yard and they sat under the big mesquite tree, all four of them, and it was so ordinary and so strange at the same time that Maude had to look down at her plate twice to remind herself of the facts of the situation. "Do you have family somewhere?" she asked. "Kansas," he said. "My mother, a sister." "Do they know where you are?" "They know I'm alive," he said. "I send a letter when I can." "I stopped telling them where I was when I figured out that someone was watching the post office in Dodge City. The Garners. The Garners have long arms," he agreed. Thomas asked, with the directness of a 10-year-old who has been listening to adult conversations his whole life and has developed very little patience for implication, "Are you going to stay?" The silence that followed was brief but substantial. "Thomas," Maude said. "It's a fair question," David said gently. He looked at Thomas with the full seriousness the boy's question deserved. "No, I've got things I have to settle before I could stay anywhere. And your mother has her own life here that doesn't need my complications added to it." Thomas looked at his mother. Maude looked at her lunch. "That's a smart answer," Thomas said finally, which apparently was high praise from a 10-year-old, because Eli immediately agreed loudly, and that dissolved whatever had been hanging in the air under the mesquite tree. The afternoon stretched long and golden, the way Arizona afternoons did in late spring before the heat became something you had to take personally. Maude found herself going about her work with a different awareness than usual, a heightened sense of the ordinary things, the sound of the well rope, the smell of the cornbread she was putting together for dinner, the way the shadows moved across the canyon walls in the east. She was not a woman who spent a great deal of time in her feelings, having learned early that feelings were expensive, and she was operating on a limited budget. But there was something happening in the quiet of that day that she could not fully account for with practicality. David Lawson was not what she had expected. She did not know exactly what she had expected. Something harder, perhaps, something more defended and less present. The stories about him had been the stories of a man who existed at the sharp edge of things, and sharp-edged men in her experience tended to look at the world the way you looked at an opponent, always calculating the angle. But David Lawson looked at things the way he looked at a fence post that needed setting, with direct attention and a willingness to simply do what needed doing. She found him at the edge of the property near dusk, standing very still and looking out across the flat expanse of desert toward the canyon mouth. She came up beside him and did not speak for a moment, following his gaze. "Anything?" she asked. "No," he said. "I've been watching for an hour, nothing moving." She nodded. They stood together in the cooling air, and the silence between them was different from the silence of that morning. It had settled into something more comfortable, less careful. "You said you have things to settle," she said. "The marshal in Tucson," he said. "Henderson, he wants my testimony in front of a judge. If I can get there and do it properly with the evidence I have, there's a real chance of putting the Garner brothers away. Not just running them off, but actually putting them somewhere they can't ride out from. You've been carrying the evidence with you." He reached into his coat and produced a slim leather satchel, well worn but carefully maintained. "Documents. Dates and names and places. 3 signed statements from men who rode with the Garners and are willing to testify if the marshal can get them proper protection." Maude stared at the satchel. "And the Garners know you have it." "They know I have something," he said. "They're not entirely sure what, but they know it's enough to be a problem or they wouldn't still be after me 8 months later." She looked at him sideways. "You could have given that to Henderson months ago." "I tried," he said quietly. "The first time I went to Henderson, one of his deputies turned out to be on Garner's payroll. The deputy tipped them off and I barely got out of Tucson alive. The second time I tried, I got as far as the edge of town, and there were 4 Garner men waiting at the courthouse steps. So you've been carrying it around waiting for the right moment. Waiting for the right moment and the right way in, he said. Henderson wrote me through an intermediary 3 weeks ago. He's cleared the deputy out and he's got a federal judge coming through Tucson in 10 days. If I can get there with this satchel and those 3 witnesses, the Garner outfit is finished. 10 days, Maude thought, and the Garner brothers somewhere in the canyon to the east. The 3 witnesses, she said. Where are they? One's in Bisbee. One's in a mining camp outside of Tombstone. One's in a settlement called Red Mesa, about 40 miles north. He paused. I was on my way to Red Mesa when Walt's boys cut me off in the canyon. She absorbed this. She was good at absorbing information quickly and sitting with it without immediately reacting, which was a skill that running a homestead alone for 3 years had refined considerably. Red Mesa is 2 days' ride from here, she said. Roughly, he agreed. You can't ride it with that wound, she said. I can ride better than you'd think, he said, but without much conviction. She turned and looked at him directly, the way she looked at problems that needed solving, clear-eyed and without the softening of wishfulness. He met her gaze without flinching, and she noticed again that thing she had noticed in the barn the previous night, that quality of steady honesty that she found, against her better instincts, rather difficult to dismiss. I'll take you to Red Mesa, she said. He blinked. Maude. It was the first time he had used her name. She felt it land somewhere in the vicinity of her sternum. Don't, she said. I've thought about it. The Garners have been a plague on this part of the territory for 3 years. I knew 2 of the families from Harker's Crossing. My neighbor Dolores Vasquez lost her husband to a Garner raid the year before last, and she's been raising 4 children by herself ever since. She stopped. If you have what you need to put them away for good, then getting you to Tucson is worth the trouble. It's not just trouble, he said. It's dangerous. So is running a homestead in Dry Creek with 2 boys and no man around, she said evenly. I know what danger looks like. I make my decisions with full knowledge of it. He was quiet for a moment. The last light was fading fast over the canyon walls, leaving the sky above them a deep and burning red. I don't want anything to happen to your boys, he said. My boys will stay with my neighbor Dolores, she said. She'll watch them for a few days. She owes me 3 plantings worth of goodwill and I've never collected. Something moved in his expression then, something that was layered and complex and that she did not try to read completely because she was not sure she was ready for what she would find there. You don't have to do this, he said. I know, she said. And that was that. She went to Dolores Vasquez's place the next morning with the boys before dawn, before the canyon showed any sign of life, and Dolores, who was a sharp-eyed woman of 34 who had survived her own considerable griefs and was not easy to surprise, looked at Maude for a long moment after she explained the situation. David Lawson, Dolores said. Yes, the man who rode with the Garners. The man who is trying to put the Garners in front of a federal judge, Maude said. Dolores looked at her boys who were already disappearing into her own children's company with the cheerful adaptability of children who like people. Then she looked at Maude. He's handsome, she said. Dolores, Maude said. I'm asking for purely practical reasons, Dolores said without any apparent conviction that this was true. How long? A week, maybe a little more. I'll come back the moment it's done. Dolores pulled her into a brief hard embrace. You come back, she said against Maude's hair, and not just because of the boys. Maude held on for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then straightened up and walked back up the road toward home, and she did not look back because she was reasonably certain that looking back would cost her something she could not afford to spend. They left before full light, Maude on her dun mare and David on Copper, who had rested 2 days and was moving better. Maude had packed light and practical, 2 days' supplies in her saddlebag, her rifle across her back, a small pistol in the holster at her hip that had been Calvin's, and that she had practiced with until she was accurate enough to feel confident. David rode with the satchel close against his body, and his eyes on the canyon approaches with a steadiness and competence that she found, despite herself, reassuring. They made good time in the early hours, moving through the desert in the pale blue light before sunrise, and Maude began to understand something about what it was to ride with someone who knew the country the way he did. He read the terrain the way she read her farm, noting what was out of place, what the silence meant, where the shadows sat wrong. He didn't talk about it. He just moved with a kind of quiet authority that adjusted their route twice in the first hour in ways that Maude only understood in retrospect, when she realized he had taken them around positions where ambush would have been easy. "You learned all of this riding with the Garners," she said, during a stretch of open ground where talking was safe. "Some of it," he said. "Some of it before. I grew up on the frontier. My father was a surveyor. He died when I was 15 and my mother had to sell the land to pay the debts and we moved to Dodge City." A pause. "I wasn't good at being a town person. Most people who come out here weren't," she said. "Calvin, my husband, he came from Baltimore. He had absolutely no idea what he was getting into. The first summer almost broke him." She paused. "He stayed anyway. He sounds like a good man." "He was," she said. "He was not made for this country the way some people are, but he chose it and he chose to be equal to it, and I think that counted for more than natural talent." "How did you lose him?" She told him about the horse and the broken back and the 3 weeks and the fever. And she told it in the straightforward way she had developed for telling it, the way that let her say the true things without the grief tearing through the practical fabric of the telling. But somewhere in the middle of it, she became aware that David was listening not in the polite and slightly uncomfortable way that people who didn't know what to do with grief usually listened, but in the way of someone who was genuinely following every word, and that awareness made something in the telling feel different. "You were alone with him those 3 weeks, David said. "Yes. That took courage. It took love," she said, and then she looked straight ahead because she had surprised herself with that. They made camp that night in a sheltered hollow in the rock that David had clearly identified from a distance. A good position, defensible, invisible from the main trail. He built a fire that was small and nearly smokeless, a skill she noted with the same appreciation she would have noted any practical competence. They ate dried meat and biscuits she'd packed and drank coffee that was better than she expected given the conditions. "Tell me about Kansas," she said. He smiled, and it was the first full smile she had seen from him, and it changed his whole face, made him look younger and less guarded and altogether more dangerous to her peace of mind. "My mother's house has a yellow door," he said. "She painted it yellow when my father died because she said the house needed to look less like a funeral. My sister Clara married a schoolteacher named Abbott who is about as different from me as a person can be, and I like him very much because he's genuinely good and Clara deserves genuinely good." "Do you miss it?" He looked at the fire. "I miss the idea of being the kind of person who could go back to it," he said. "I've been moving for a long time. Long enough that I'm not always sure I know how to be still." She thought about that. "I've been so still for 3 years that I've almost forgotten how to move," she said. "Maybe that's the opposite problem." He looked at her over the fire, and the light caught in his brown eyes and she made herself look at the fire instead. "You're moving now," he said quietly. "I am," she said. They kept watches through the night, 4 hours each, and Maude sat her watch with her rifle across her knees and the desert silence around her and thought about all the reasons this was entirely impractical, and none of the reasons it felt like something else. Nothing came in the night. They reached Red Mesa the following afternoon, a small settlement of maybe 40 people on the edge of a vast flat plain with the red rocks rising behind it like a cathedral wall. The man they were looking for was named Samuel Pryor, a former Garner hand who had gotten out 2 years ago and had been living quietly and fearfully in Red Mesa under a different name since then, running a small feed store and waiting for the day the Garners either found him or were stopped. He was a slight man in his mid-40s with nervous hands and the eyes of someone who had spent a long time watching doors. When David walked in and put the satchel on the counter and said, quietly, that Marshall Henderson had a federal judge in Tucson in 8 days, Samuel Pryor sat down heavily on the stool behind his counter and put his hands over his face. When he looked up, there were tears on his face. "I've been waiting for this for 2 years," he said. Maude stood to the side and watched David talk to him, watched the patient and careful way David explained the situation, what the plan was, what the risks were, what Henderson was offering in terms of protection. He did not minimize the danger. He did not oversell the promise. He simply laid it out honestly and let the man make his own decision. Samuel Pryor said yes. They stayed in Red Mesa one night at the small hotel, which offered 2 rooms on separate floors, and in the morning they rode out with Samuel Pryor beside them on a borrowed mule that he declared was more reliable than any horse he'd ever owned. Maude thought he was probably right about the mule. The second witness in Bisbee was a younger man named Cole, barely 20, who had gotten involved with the Garners the way young men sometimes did, through bad luck and a shortage of better options, and who had been wanting to get out ever since the business at Harker's Crossing. He was nearly tearfully grateful to David, and looked at Maude with such open curiosity that she felt compelled to explain herself, which she then decided she did not owe him and stopped doing. The third witness, in the mining camp outside Tombstone, took a day longer to locate and required David to do some considerable persuading, because the man, whose name was Ferris, had a wife and a small child and was understandably reluctant to put them in danger. In the end, it was Maude who tipped the balance, coming into the conversation at the point where Ferris's wife, a pale and determined woman named Grace, asked what kind of assurance there was of real protection, and Maude answered with the plain directness of a woman who knew exactly what life looked like without it. "You're already in danger," she said to Grace, gently but without softening. "The Garners have been building this territory around their own benefit for 3 years. Every family out here is vulnerable for as long as they ride free. Your husband can help end it, or he can keep waiting for it to end on its own, and I can tell you from experience that things do not end on their own out here." Grace looked at her. Ferris looked at Grace. Something passed between them that was private and absolute. "All right," Ferris said. Now they were 4, heading for Tucson with 5 days to spare before the federal judge arrived, and the desert spread before them with the particular open beauty that the territory wore in late spring, wildflowers at the base of the saguaro, the sky enormous and blue and deeply indifferent to the human business being conducted beneath it. David rode beside Maude with the other 3 a few yards behind, and for a long stretch of the afternoon they simply rode together in the comfortable silence that had developed between them over the past several days, a silence that Maude had come to recognize as rare and valuable, the kind that meant you did not have to perform anything for the other person. "When this is done," he said, and then stopped. "What?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking ahead. "I've been thinking about what I said to your boy Thomas, about having things to settle." "I remember," she said. "When this is done," he said again, more carefully this time, "I was thinking about what comes after." "I haven't let myself think about that for a long time." Maude kept her eyes on the trail. Her heart was doing something she would have preferred it not to do, but she was not in the habit of lying to herself about what was happening in her chest. "What do you think about?" she asked. He was very quiet for a moment. A jackrabbit burst from the scrub ahead and the horses both flinched and recovered. "Yellow doors," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with that direct and honest brown gaze, and there was something in it that was careful and open at the same time, something that was making the question very clearly without making it too much. "David," she said. "I know," he said. "I know it's not the right time. I know we've known each other less than a week. I know you have your boys and your land and a life you've built that doesn't need me complicating it." He looked ahead. "I'm just telling you what I think about, that's all." Maude turned forward and rode for a while without speaking. "Calvin's grave is under the big juniper on the east side of the property," she said finally. "I planted the juniper myself after. I talk to him sometimes when I'm working near it. Not because I think he hears me, more because saying things out loud helps me know if they're true." David waited. "I haven't thought about what comes after in 3 years either," she said. I've thought about this season's crop. I've thought about whether the water table is dropping. I've thought about Eli's cough last winter and whether Thomas is growing too fast for his boots. I've thought about the mortgage payment and whether the back fence will hold through another summer. She paused. I haven't thought about doors. He looked at her. I'm starting to, she said quietly. Neither of them said anything more for a while, and the desert moved past them in its unhurried way, and the sky went from blue to gold, and it was, Maude thought, one of the most significant conversations she had ever had in terms of how little had actually been said. They made camp that night at the edge of a wide, dry riverbed, the kind of camp that felt open and exposed after the sheltered hollow of the first night. But David's reading of the ground told him it was the safer position, and she trusted his reading. Samuel Pryor had turned out to be a good campfire companion, a man whose nervousness decreased in proportion to his distance from Red Mesa, and he told stories about his time before the Garners that were genuinely funny, and that made even the taciturn Ferris crack a smile. Cole, who was the youngest and still had some of the energy of youth that older fatigue hadn't yet worn down, asked David what his plan was after Tucson, with the directness of the young, and David answered him honestly, in a way that Maude heard very clearly while appearing to arrange her bedroll. I want to find a piece of land somewhere, David said. Something small and workable. I want to do something that makes rather than takes. A pause. I haven't settled anywhere since I was 15. I think I'm ready. Ready is a thing you have to decide, Samuel said sagely, in the manner of a man who has spent considerable time sitting with his own decisions. I've decided, David said. Maude lay down and looked up at the enormous sprawl of stars above the Arizona desert and thought about what it meant to decide. In the morning they encountered their first genuine trouble. It came in the form of two riders on the ridge above the riverbed, visible at first only as shapes against the sunrise, but identifiable to David's practiced eye within moments as trouble. He turned his horse without haste and spoke quietly to the group. Keep moving, he said. Normal pace, don't look up. Garners, Maude asked. Garner men, he said. Not the brothers themselves, but hired eyes. They've been tracking us, which means Walt knows I'm not dead. What do we do? There's a town called Sutter's Ford about 6 miles west, he said. It's a proper town, real law, and even Garner's money doesn't reach the marshal there. If we can reach Sutter's Ford, they won't follow us in. 6 miles, Cole said, with the particular brightness of someone calculating how bad this could get. We ride, David said simply. They rode. Not at a panic gallop, because that would tell the men on the ridge everything they needed to know, but at the brisk, purposeful pace of people with a clear destination. And David kept them on the trail that curved close to the ridge and then away from it, using the terrain to obscure their movements. And the 6 miles went by with Maude's rifle across her saddle bow and her heart working harder than the riding alone accounted for. They reached Sutter's Ford, and the riders did not follow them in. The marshal at Sutter's Ford was a broad-shouldered man named Pike who had been doing his job in that particular stretch of Arizona for 12 years and had exactly the kind of weathered competence that tenure produced. David explained the situation in his direct and unglamorous way and presented the satchel, and Marshal Pike looked through the documents with the careful attention of a man who understood their significance. Henderson's been building toward this for a long time, Pike said. I'll send a rider to Tucson tonight, let him know you're on the way with these witnesses. He looked at Maude. And you, ma'am. I'm making sure he gets there, Maude said. Pike looked at her and then at David with the expression of a man who has seen many things in 12 years and is revising his understanding of one of them. I'll put you up for the night, he said. Garner men won't move on this town. They slept in actual beds, the first beds in 4 days, and Maude lay in the narrow room of the marshal's guest quarters and stared at the ceiling and thought about everything that had happened in less than a week with the focused intensity she usually reserved for farm problems. She was not a woman who confused gratitude with love or proximity with affection. She had spent enough time alone to know the difference between wanting company and wanting a particular person, and she was honest enough with herself to know which of those she was experiencing. This was not gratitude. This was something she had not felt in a long time, something she had been quite certain she would not feel again, a specific and inconvenient rightness about a particular human being. She thought about what Dolores would say. Dolores would say it, loudly and with considerable satisfaction. She thought about what Thomas would say. Thomas would ask another one of his perfectly precise questions. She thought about Eli, who had looked at David with the open, trusting admiration that young boys reserved for men who talked to them like people. And she thought about the fence post that had been set straight, and the chicken coop hinge, and the patient answers given to an 8-year-old's questions. She thought about yellow doors. She did not sleep for a long time. In the morning, with 2 days until the federal judge arrived in Tucson, they made the final push. The ride was long and open, through some of the most starkly beautiful country in the territory, the great saguaro standing like witnesses on the ridgelands, the desert floor painted with the brief spring color that would be burned away in another few weeks by the summer heat. Maude had ridden through this country many times and had always found its beauty somewhat theoretical, the kind of beauty that required more than one person to properly appreciate. She found that with someone beside her it became real and immediate, the way a joke becomes funny when there is someone to share it with. They talked off and on through the long hours of riding, nothing urgent. The kind of talking that happens between people when the business is handled, and what remains is simply the pleasure of the other person's company. He told her about the geography of Kansas, flat and enormous and green in a way the desert never was. She told him about the first time she had seen the Arizona Canyon country and how it had looked, to a girl from the Ohio Valley, like the landscape of some other world entirely. He told her about his mother's cooking, which apparently was legendary among the people of her Kansas neighborhood. She told him about Calvin's first attempt to build a chicken coop, which had resulted in a structure that the chickens had refused to enter on what seemed like principled grounds. He laughed at that, a full genuine laugh that she felt in her own chest, and she looked at him sideways and thought, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she had not made a person laugh like that in a very long time. "Tell me something true," he said, sometime in the middle of the afternoon. She thought about it. "I'm afraid of being ordinary," she said, "not in a grand way, in the way of someday being just a person who kept things going and nothing more." He was quiet for a moment. "You let a man with my history into your house," he said. "You packed your saddle and rode across 50 miles of open country with 3 strangers and a wounded man to make sure a piece of justice got delivered. I don't think ordinary is what you need to worry about." She looked at him. "Tell me something true." He met her eyes. "I've been thinking about Dry Creek," he said. "About that fence post. About whether the back fence is going to hold through another summer. About whether Eli's cough comes back in the winter." A pause. "About whether the woman who owns that property would let me come back to it." The silence that followed was warm and wide and serious. "You'd have to answer a lot of Thomas's questions," she said finally. "I'm prepared for that," he said. She faced forward. She was smiling, and she was not entirely in control of it, and the desert spread before them into Tucson, where a federal judge was waiting and justice was going to be delivered. And she thought about how a thing that started with a shot and a bleeding stranger, and a door she had almost not opened, had arrived at this conversation on this road on this particular afternoon. They reached Tucson before sundown. Marshall Henderson was a wiry, red-haired man of about 45 with the contained urgency of someone who has been working toward something for a long time and can feel it finally becoming real. He met them at the edge of town himself, having received Marshal Pike's message, and he shook David's hand with a grip that conveyed everything he clearly felt was above him to say. He looked at the 3 witnesses. He looked at the satchel. He looked at Maude with the assessment of a man who understood what this had required. "Ma'am," he said. "Get them somewhere safe," she said. He did. There was a safe house, guarded by 3 reliable deputies, and Samuel Pryor and Cole and Ferris were installed in it with their supper and their protection. And Marshal Henderson sat down with David and the satchel for 3 hours while Maude waited at the hotel that Henderson had arranged, sitting by the window watching the street below with her rifle close at hand, and her thoughts doing what thoughts do when the urgent business is finally concluded, and what remains is the quieter country of what comes next. David came back at 9 o'clock. He knocked at her door and she opened it, and he stood in the hallway looking like a man who has put down a very heavy thing he has been carrying for a long time, and the relief in his face was so complete and so unguarded that she stepped back from the door to let him in without thinking about it. He sat in the chair by the window and she sat on the edge of the bed, and they looked at each other in the lamplight. "It's done?" she asked. "Henderson has everything he needs," he said. "The judge hears the case the day after tomorrow. Henderson has enough for warrants on all 3 Garner brothers and 6 of their lieutenants. With the 3 witnesses, he says it's airtight." He paused. "It's done." "As done as I can make it." She let that settle. "How do you feel?" she asked. He thought about it. "Like I've been holding my breath for a year," he said, "and I just stopped." She looked at him. He looked at her. The lamplight was warm and steady between them, and outside the sounds of Tucson at night came up through the window, horses and voices and the distant music from one of the saloons. "David," she said. "I know," he said. "I know what I said on the trail. I know what it means and what it asks. And I'm not going to press you or hurry you or pretend that a week is enough basis for anything as permanent as what I'm hoping for." She stood up and crossed the room and sat in the other chair, the one close to him, close enough that when she put her hand on the arm of his chair, her fingers were an inch from his. "I spent 3 years," she said quietly, "being very certain that I was finished with hoping for things I couldn't manage alone, that I had enough which was true and didn't need more which was less true." She looked at her hand. "You reset a fence post I've been meaning to fix since February. You answered every one of Eli's questions. You were honest about Harker's Crossing when you could have not been." She paused. "You said yellow doors." He moved his hand so that it covered hers, and the warmth of it was very simple and very complete. "Maude," he said, and her name in his mouth was serious and careful and full of things that were being said without being said. "Come back to Dry Creek," she said, "not to complicate my life, to see if we can build something, slowly and honestly, because that's the only way I know how to build." "Slowly and honestly," he said. "Yes, those are terms I can meet." She turned her hand under his so that their fingers were laced together, and the simplicity of it, of 2 hands in the lamplight in a hotel room in Tucson, was so entirely different from the strangeness of everything that had brought them here that she almost laughed. "You'll have to introduce yourself properly to Dolores," she said. "She will have opinions." "I'm prepared for opinions," he said. "And Thomas will ask you 12 questions in the first 5 minutes." "I like Thomas's questions," he said. "They're always the right questions." She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. Outside, Tucson continued its business, and in the hotel room above it, 2 people who had both been very certain they were finished with certain kinds of things sat quietly and discovered they were wrong. The trial went exactly as Henderson had said it would. The federal judge was a meticulous man named Hargrove, who had arrived from Denver with the particular reputation of someone who could not be bought, which was apparently why he had been specifically requested for this case. The 3 witnesses testified with the steady clarity of people who have been frightened for a long time and have finally found a place where their fear can be put to use. David's documents, which he had spent a year maintaining and protecting through cold and heat, and the constant company of the Garner brothers' pursuit, provided the corroboration that turned testimony into proof. Maude sat in the gallery during the proceedings, which took the better part of 2 days, and watched the legal mechanisms of the territorial justice system work with the slow, grinding reliability of a well-maintained millstone. She had seen the courts work badly before, with Prescott and the banker's lawyers, and she was alert to the places where it might slip. But Henderson had done his preparation thoroughly, and the Garner brothers' own lawyers, when they arrived, seemed to understand that the ground had shifted in a fundamental way. Walt Garner, who was brought in under guard on the second day, was a heavy-set man in his late 40s with a face like a closed fist and the cold, pale eyes of someone who had been used to the world arranging itself around his requirements. He looked across the courtroom at David with an expression that was perfectly, deliberately blank, the expression of a man who is calculating rather than feeling, and David met it without flinching or looking away, and Maude, watching them both, understood something about what it had cost David to carry this thing all the way to this room. The verdict was delivered on the third morning. Guilty on 17 counts across the 3 Garner brothers. Federal penitentiary. The other warrants would be served in the coming weeks, Henderson told David afterward, standing in the courthouse hall with the contained satisfaction of a man who has achieved the thing he set out to achieve. The Garner outfit was finished as an operational concern in the territory of Arizona. David stood in the hall and Henderson shook his hand again, and the 3 witnesses came out, and there was a brief exchange between them that had the quality of people who have been through something significant together and are now arriving at the other side of it. Samuel Pryor told David, with the slightly emotional frankness of a man who had been frightened for 2 years and was no longer frightened, that he was grateful in a way he did not have adequate words for. "Go home," David told him, "or find a new one if home doesn't fit anymore. But go." Samuel Pryor nodded and wiped his eyes without embarrassment and went. Maude came out of the courthouse and stood beside David in the late morning sun, and they both looked down the main street of Tucson, which was doing its ordinary business as if the event that had just concluded inside the building behind them were a matter of no particular significance, which from Tucson's perspective it largely was not. "That's it," she said. "That's it," he said. She bumped her shoulder against his arm, which was not the kind of gesture she normally made, and he looked down at her and she looked up at him, and they stood there on the courthouse steps of Tucson, Arizona in the spring of 1882, and the story that had begun with a shot in a canyon and a stranger at a gate arrived at a different place. He kissed her. It was not a complicated kiss. It was not a performance. It was simply a man who had been wanting to do that for several days making the decision to do it, and a woman who had been thinking about yellow doors deciding that yellow doors were a reasonable thing to think about, and the street of Tucson went around them entirely unconcerned. When they separated, she looked at him for a moment and then said, "We need to get back to my boys." "Yes," he said, "we do." They rode back together, and it was different now. The riding, not in any way that would have been obvious to a stranger, but in the way that everything is different when something has been decided, and the deciding is honest and clean. They talked and rode and camped one night under the stars, and the fire was warm and the conversation was easy, and when they woke in the morning there was frost on the bedrolls because it was still spring and the desert nights were cold, and they saddled up in the early light and pointed themselves north and east toward Dry Creek. They stopped at Dolores Vasquez's place. The boys were in the yard when they rode up, Eli running toward them before the horses had fully stopped, launching himself off the porch step with the complete confidence of a child who expects to be caught. And David, without any apparent hesitation, reached down from Copper and caught him and swung him up, and the boy laughed with the pure, uncomplicated joy of children who are simply happy. And Maude sat on her dun mare and watched this and felt something in her chest that was large and full and entirely good. Thomas came out more slowly and with more dignity, in the manner of a 10-year-old who considers himself too old for running, but arrived at the fence post approximately 30 seconds after his brother. He looked at David with his serious, appraising eyes. "Did you do it?" he said. "The Garner brothers are in federal custody," David said. "It's over." Thomas nodded with the gravity of someone who understands what that means. "Good," he said. Then with the same direct precision he always applied, "Are you staying?" David looked at Maude. Maude looked at her son, her very perceptive and entirely too accurate 10-year-old son, and then at the man on the horse with her 8-year-old already sitting in front of him like it was the most natural thing in the world, and she said, "We're going to talk about it. Properly. Together." Thomas looked at this answer for a moment and apparently found it satisfactory because he allowed himself a small smile. Dolores came out onto her porch with her arms crossed and her expression set in the particular configuration that meant she had spent the better part of a week forming opinions and intended to share them. She looked at Maude. She looked at David. She looked at the way Eli was sitting entirely comfortably in the saddle in front of him. She looked at Maude again. "Well," she said in Spanish and then in English, "about time." "Dolores," Maude said. "I'll start dinner," Dolores said. "You can tell me everything." They stayed for dinner, all of them around Dolores' big table, and the conversation was loud and good and full of children's voices and laughter. And Dolores watched everything with the satisfaction of someone who has correctly identified a situation from the beginning and is not surprised by how it has developed. After dinner, when the children had been settled and the dishes cleared, Dolores took Maude aside in the kitchen and looked at her with the straight-on honesty that was the reason Maude had always valued her friendship. "You're sure?" Dolores said. "I'm careful," Maude said. "I'm honest about what I know and what I don't yet, but yes, I'm sure." Dolores nodded slowly. "He looks at you the way Frank used to look at me," she said, and her voice was level but her eyes were not. Maude reached out and took her hand and held it for a moment. "He will be good to the boys," Dolores said more steadily. "I can see that." "I know," Maude said. They went back to Maude's homestead in the late evening, the four of them, and Maude stood at the door of her house and looked at the dark yard, and the fence posts standing properly straight in the east line, and the chicken coop with its properly hinged door, and the big juniper on the far side where Calvin was buried. And she breathed in the night air of the place she had built with her own hands and her own grief, and her own absolute refusal to be otherwise than who she was. David stood beside her. "Stay tonight," she said, "in the barn. I'm not suggesting anything other than that you need a proper roof and your horse needs the stall and the boys are already asking where Copper is going to sleep." "Copper would appreciate the stall," he said, with the gravity of a man discussing a matter of genuine importance. "Tomorrow," she said, "we'll talk, properly, about what this looks like, practically." "Slowly and honestly," he said. "Slowly and honestly," she agreed. He nodded. He took her hand briefly. Just the same simple clasp as in the hotel room, warm and certain. And then he walked Copper to the barn and she went inside and bolted the door and lay down in her own bed in her own house and looked at the ceiling. And for the first time in 3 years, the ceiling did not seem like a lid. The weeks that followed were the careful, honest weeks that she had asked for, and he gave them to her exactly as she had asked. He stayed in the barn and then, when the boys made the logical and forceful argument that the small outbuilding off the east side of the house was sitting empty and it was foolish not to use it, he moved to the outbuilding, which Maude and Calvin had originally built as a second storage space, and which, with some work, became a simple and serviceable room. He worked the farm. Not as an employee and not as an owner but as a partner, which was exactly the word she used when she introduced him to people in town, the people who arrived at Dolores' information pipeline with their eyes full of questions. "He's helping out," she said at first, and then, "he's working with me." And then, eventually, "he's my partner," which was close enough to true and left the other questions, the ones she was still answering in the privacy of her own heart for her own timeline. He was, she discovered over those weeks, exactly the same person he had been on the trail, which was the best thing she could have discovered. He did not perform helpfulness. He simply did what needed doing. He did not manage the boys. He was present for them, which was different and much more valuable. He answered Thomas's 12 questions a day, and Eli's 18 questions a day with the same patient genuineness, and he sat with them at supper, and listened to them argue about the things that boys argue about, and was neither overwhelmed by them nor falsely cheerful with them. He went to Calvin's juniper one afternoon, alone, not knowing she was watching from the kitchen window, and stood there for a while in the way of someone paying respect to a thing they understand is important without needing to make a statement about it. She loved him for that. She told him so on a Wednesday evening in June, sitting on the porch in the last of the light with the boys inside and the crickets beginning their warm-weather chorus in the scrub. "I love you," she said. It came out plainly, without preamble, in the way things came out when you had decided they were true and decided not to be afraid of them. He turned to look at her. His expression was the most open she had ever seen it, stripped entirely of the careful guardedness that had been his default condition when he had arrived at her door bleeding and spent and holding on out of sheer will. "Maude," he said. "Don't make it complicated," she said. "It's not complicated," he said. "I love you." I've been trying to figure out when was the right moment, and then I realized the right moment was probably whenever you said it first because you're braver than me about most things. She laughed. It was a full, genuine, slightly surprised laugh, and he laughed with her, and the porch was warm and the desert evening was settling in around them, and it was, she thought, one of the finest moments she had ever sat in. He asked her to marry him in July. He asked her in the kitchen while she was making biscuits, which was not particularly romantic in the traditional sense, and she had flour on her hands and he had just come in from fixing the roof of the barn, and he simply stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her and said, "I want to marry you, Maude. I want to be here. I want to be their father if they'll let me. I want this to be the place I stop." She set down her biscuit dough. "Ask Thomas," she said. "He's the one who decides things around here." He was quiet for a moment and then he said very seriously, "I already did." She stared at him. "Yesterday," he said, "I asked him what he thought. He told me 3 reasons why it was a good idea and 1 concern, which was that I didn't know how to fix the water pump, and I told him I was prepared to learn, and he said he guessed that was acceptable." She was, for possibly the first time in her adult life, completely without words. "Eli," he said, "just asked if copper could stay forever." Maude put her flour-covered hands over her face and laughed until she was nearly crying, and he crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her from behind, careful of the flour, and she leaned back into him and felt the solid reality of it, the warmth and the steadiness of someone who had asked her boys before he asked her, who had checked with a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old because he understood that her life was not separable from theirs. "Yes," she said into her floury hands. "Yes, David." They were married in September, in the yard outside the house under the big mesquite tree, with Dollar standing up beside Maude and Marshall Pike, who had come down from Sutter's Ford for the occasion, standing beside David, and the boys in their best clothes that Maude had let out twice in the summer because they refused to stop growing. The traveling preacher who served the Dry Creek area said the words, simple and old and significant, and they exchanged them with the kind of seriousness that people give to things they have thought about carefully and chosen deliberately. And when the preacher finished and David kissed her, the small assembled crowd of their neighbors, about 20 people in total, responded with the particular warm approval of a community watching 2 people who deserve a good thing get one. Thomas shook David's hand with enormous solemnity. Eli, abandoning all pretense of the dignity of an almost 9-year-old, grabbed him around the middle and held on, and David held him back with one arm and reached out his other hand to Thomas and pulled him in 2, and Maude looked at the 3 of them together under the mesquite tree in September light and felt, deeply and without qualification, that this was right. Dollar's cried, which she would later deny, and celebrated in the way she celebrated most important events, by producing enormous quantities of food and talking without stopping for approximately 3 hours, and it was exactly the right kind of wedding reception for 2 people who valued substance over ceremony. They wrote to his mother in Kansas. The letter that came back was long and warm and full of a mother's barely contained joy, and enclosed a recipe that came with the note. "This is the biscuit recipe. I am sending it to Maude directly so she doesn't have to get it through you. Welcome to the family, Maude." Maude put the letter in the tin box under the bed, the one that had her medical supplies, because she kept all important things there, and she kept it there for the rest of her life. In November, she told David she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen again, because apparently the kitchen was where the significant things happened in their household, and he stood very still for a moment and looked at her with an expression that was so entirely unguarded, so purely full of something enormous and uncontainable, that she felt it reflected back in her own chest like a mirror. "Maude," he said, and he took both her hands in his, carefully, as if something precious were involved. "I know," she said. "I know. I've done this before twice and I know what it takes, but I'm healthy and it's early and I'm not afraid." "I'm a little afraid," he said honestly. "That's all right," she said. "That's the appropriate amount of afraid. I'll be annoyed if you're not afraid at all." He pressed his forehead against hers, and she felt him breathe, just breathe, the two of them standing in the kitchen with the November wind coming around the corners of the house and the boys in the other room with their noise and their arguments and their total unawareness of what had just been said. "I want to tell the boys," she said. "Thomas will have questions," he said. "About 12, she agreed. Thomas did, in fact, have questions. He sat with them at the dinner table that evening and listened to the news with the focused concentration of a 10-year-old who is processing significant data. And then he asked, in the following order: when? How did they know it was a boy? What would happen if it was a girl? Who was going to help? Whether David knew anything about babies? Whether Dollars was going to be involved? And whether the baby would get its own room or share with him and Eli? David answered every single question with complete seriousness, and Maude watched him do it and thought about all the kinds of love there were, and how some of them looked exactly like this. Eli said, "What are we going to name it?" "We don't know yet," Maude said. "Copper is a good name," Eli offered. "That's already taken," David said gravely. "The horse might share," Eli said. "The winter was quiet and good." David had settled fully into the work of the farm, with the kind of competence that comes from being genuinely invested in the outcome. And by December the back fence was solid, and the water pump was understood, which satisfied Thomas's one concern. And the homestead had the particular feel of a place that is being properly maintained by people who care about it. He wrote to Marshal Henderson in December, and got a letter back reporting that the Garner brothers had been transferred to the federal penitentiary in New Mexico without incident, and that the warrants on the remaining members of the outfit had been served and processed. The territory was cleaner for it. Henderson thanked David in plain and sincere language and added a postscript that said, "I heard you married and settled in Dry Creek. Good. You deserve somewhere to be." David left that letter on the kitchen table where Maude found it, and she read it and then looked out the window at the yard where he and Thomas were working on something together, a project involving wood and nails that Thomas had apparently proposed, and David had apparently accepted without asking too many questions about whether it was practical, and she folded the letter carefully and put it in the tin box. The baby arrived in July, in the full summer heat, with Dollars attending because Dollars had delivered approximately 11 babies in the surrounding area and had strong opinions about how it was done. It was a boy, which surprised nobody who had been paying attention to the odds, and he was large and dark-haired and announced himself with a volume that immediately established his position in the household. They named him James, after David's father, and William after Calvin's father. And James William Lawson came into the world in the upstairs room of the homestead in Dry Creek, with the summer heat pressing down outside, and his father waiting at the bottom of the stairs with his elder brothers, one of whom was asking extremely specific questions about what was happening, and one of whom had fallen asleep on David's shoulder at some point around midnight. When Dollars came down and said it was done, David went up with Eli still asleep against his neck, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Maude, who was exhausted and triumphant in equal measure, and at the baby, who had stopped crying and was looking at the world with the unfocused intensity of someone encountering existence for the first time. "James," David said, quietly, as if trying the name on the world. "James," Maude confirmed. He put out one careful finger, and the baby's hand closed around it with the absolute reflexive trust of infants, and the expression on his face, was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Thomas appeared in the doorway, having come upstairs under his own power at the sound of voices, and looked at the scene with his characteristic assessment. "He's smaller than I expected," Thomas said. "He was bigger than I expected," Maude said with feeling. Thomas smiled. It was one of his real smiles, the ones that transformed his serious face entirely. "He looks like David," he said. David looked up at him. "Is that a problem?" "No," Thomas said in the tone of someone issuing a decision. "It's good." He came and sat on the other side of the bed and looked at his new brother with the grave, focused attention he gave to all important things. And Eli woke up on David's shoulder and blinked and looked around and saw the baby and said, with enormous sleepy sincerity, "Oh, he's really here." "He's really here," Maude said. She reached out and David took her hand, and she was very tired and very full, and the summer night outside the window was dark and warm, and the crickets were singing in the scrub, and the lamp was burning low. And in the modest homestead in Dry Creek, Arizona, in the summer of 1883, the Lawson family was complete and real and deeply, unarguably itself. The years that followed were the years that mattered most, the ones that were built of ordinary things stacked carefully one on another. Fences and harvests and water table arguments and the long summer nights on the porch and the winters that tested everything and the springs that renewed everything. Thomas grew into a young man of 17 who was already talking about studying law, because he had been thinking about what David had done in Tucson for 7 years and had decided that the thing the territory needed was people who could fight inside the courts instead of around them. David listened to this with the full seriousness it deserved and wrote to a lawyer he knew in Tucson about what was possible. Eli grew into a boy who could fix anything mechanical, who had taken the water pump completely apart at age 12 and rebuilt it better, and who had his father's easy manner with people and his mother's implacability in the face of difficulty, which was a combination that suited the territory well. James grew fast and loud and affectionate, with David's square jaw and Maude's dark eyes, and from the time he could walk he followed his father and brothers everywhere with the total committed determination of a youngest child who has decided that keeping up is a matter of principle. And 2 years after James, there was Clara. Named for David's sister in Kansas, Clara Lawson came into the world in October of 1885 with the same announcement of herself that James had made, and she arrived with red hair that had apparently been hiding somewhere in the family inheritance for a generation, and she was, from her very first weeks, entirely herself, a fact that everyone in the household recognized and accepted immediately. David's mother came from Kansas the winter after Clara was born, because a letter with a photograph of her granddaughter was not, she had written back, remotely sufficient, and she arrived on the stage to Dry Creek in December and was greeted by all 4 children and 2 adults and Dolores Vasquez, who had come because Dolores came to all important arrivals, and she was a small, bright-eyed woman with gray hair and a yellow scarf that she wore against the Arizona cold, and she looked at everything. The house and the yard and the children and Maude, with the clear-eyed appreciation of a woman who spent her life paying attention. She held Clara for an hour at the kitchen table without putting her down and told Maude about every member of the family going back 2 generations and said, at the end of it, that she thought Maude was the best thing that had ever happened to her son, and she hoped Maude knew that. "I do," Maude said. "He's the best thing that happened to me too." She said it plainly, without drama, because she was not a woman who dressed things up, and it was simply true. David's mother stayed for 3 weeks and departed on a cold January morning with Clara's handprint in ink on a piece of paper that she declared she was going to have framed, and 4 grandchildren watching the stage coach from the road with varying degrees of their own emotions. Life in Dry Creek went on. The homestead grew, not in the frantic way of people trying to prove something, but in the organic way of people who know what they have and take care of it. A new section of garden, because Maude had ideas about what she could grow if the water was managed correctly, and David spent 2 months figuring out how to manage it correctly. A second room added to the house for the children as they grew, because 4 children and 2 adults in a small homestead required some structural accommodation. A proper smokehouse, which had been on Maude's list since year 2 of the homestead and which was now, finally, done. The territory itself was changing around them. The railroad had come through the area in 1882 and was changing how the land connected to the wider world. New families were arriving every season, and the town of Dry Creek was growing in the slow, certain way of places that had something worth staying for. There were fights still, because the frontier was still the frontier, and there were injustices that law was slow to address. The dispossession of Apache families from lands that had been theirs before anyone else was there. The inequality that ran along the lines of money and race and connection, in ways that the courts were not yet ready to fully examine. David had conversations with Thomas about these things, serious ones, and Thomas had his 12 questions, and then went away and thought about them, and came back with 12 more. And Maude listened to her son becoming someone who understood the world in all its complication, and felt proud of the person he was growing into. The summer that Thomas turned 17, the family received a letter from Clara in Kansas. Not David's sister Clara, but a girl from a family 2 homesteads over named Clara Jennings, who had been Thomas's quietly acknowledged particular interest for 2 years, and who wrote to say that her family was moving to Tucson, and could Thomas possibly write. Thomas showed the letter to his parents with the careful composure of someone trying very hard to appear less moved than he was, and Maude and David both managed to say the right things with straight faces, and after Thomas went to bed, David looked at Maude from across the kitchen with his eyes bright. "He is exactly like you," he said. "He is nothing like me," she said. "He's carrying that letter around like it's a federal document," David said. "He is exactly like you," Maude said. They went on in this manner for several minutes, and then David pulled her into his arms in the kitchen where significant things happened, and she rested her head against his chest and felt his heartbeat and the warmth of the house around them and the sounds of their children sleeping. "We did something good here," he said quietly. She looked up at him. His hair had some gray in it now at the temples, just beginning, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes from years of sun and years of smiling, and he was, she thought, more fully himself than the bleeding stranger who had come to her gate 5 years ago in a way that she understood was not despite the years but because of them. "We did," she said. He kissed her, and it was not the first of those kisses or the 100th, but it was, as each of them had been, entirely real and entirely his. She thought of the evening he had arrived, of the shot ringing through the canyon, of how she had stood in the doorway with her rifle and her jaw set, and her absolute certainty that she did not need anyone's help. She thought of how the people of Dry Creek had watched with the particular combination of concern and curiosity that communities directed toward developments they had opinions about. She thought of Dolers saying he was handsome with her arms crossed and her knowing eyes. He was the last person anyone expected to show up at her door. She had been the last person who expected to let him in. And on a warm summer evening in 1887, in the homestead she had built with her own stubbornness and his steady hands, with 4 children asleep in the rooms above them, and the desert night pouring in through the open window and the yellow door she had painted the spring after their wedding, because the house had needed to look less like a chapter and more like a beginning, standing open to the soft air. She held his hand in the kitchen and understood that the best decisions she had ever made had been the ones she had not expected to make. "Come sit on the porch," she said. "Yes," he said, and they went out together into the Arizona night, into the enormous quiet of the desert and the big sprawl of stars above the canyon walls, and they sat in the 2 chairs that faced east toward the sunrise, and the crickets sang in the scrub, and the juniper stood quiet in the dark, and the homestead breathed around them, full of everything they had built. "Tell me something true," he said, which had become a thing between them, a habit of years. She looked at the stars for a moment. "I would let you in again," she said. "Every time." He took her hand. "Every time," he said. And the desert night settled around them, warm and patient and immense, as it had been before them and would be after them. And inside the house the children slept, and the yellow door stood open to whatever came next. And the story of Maude and David Lawson, which had begun with a shot in a canyon and a stranger at a gate and a woman who had been certain she was done with certain kinds of things, came to rest in the deeply ordinary, deeply extraordinary quiet of two people, exactly where they were supposed to be.